Consciousness is the subject matter of phenomenology. And yet, there is disagreement about what consciousness is. There was such disagreement already in the early years of phenomenology, the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So we are most familiar with phenomenology from that time in the work of Edmund Husserl, but we also know that he studied under Franz Brentano, and this is where he picked up the notion of intentionality, the consciousness of something. So that, in fact, appears to be the prevailing model of consciousness uh, for Brentano and his school, which I call Austrian Phenomenology. This school includes not only Husserl, but also Alexius Meinong, Anton Marti, Casimir Twardowski, and Christian von Ehrenfels, and others. Whom I won't mention at the moment. I just want to point out that when they describe consciousness, they are first and foremost concerned with intentionality, the consciousness of something. So that in the case of very elementary conscious event, seeing the color, seeing red, for example, for them you have to distinguish between the occurrence of seeing and what is seen, the color. The occurrence of seeing is an intentionally directed act of consciousness. Now, under the label of phenomenology, there were other things going on besides this Austrian phenomenology. There developed in Munich a whole current of phenomenology, mainly under the leadership of Theodor Lipps and his student Alexander Fender. Lipps died in 1910, and Fender carried the torch of a kind of description of psychology in which, to some degree, intentionality was considered, but their main focus was consciousness as experience belonging to the self. So that's the focal notion here in Munich phenomenology, the self. So Lipps was especially known for thematizing feeling as the primary experience that belongs to the self. And he liked to refer to the self as the felt self, das gefühlte Ich. And Fender carried on in that vein. This is very interesting in the history of phenomenology because Whoso, the phenomenologist for many, Whoso actually did not want to bring the self into the domain of his phenomenological description. He thought that you could do without positing a self. He said he couldn't even find it, um, but he did find acts of consciousness, uh, acts of consciousness understood as these occurrences in which we are conscious of something. Of course, who is conscious? What is conscious? That always remains a question. Uh, in fact, there are questions attached to all these theories of consciousness, no doubt. Um, but there it was. Whoso had this idea of consciousness as consisting of acts. He did allow for certain contents, such as sensations, which are not acts, but these are all get apprehended in consciousness such that we have perceptions. So that if I am seeing red, of course, this Husserl fully allows for this to be an intentionally directed event of consciousness. But he says that there is some ingredient in consciousness, the sensation of red, which gets apprehended in this perception of red. Um, and yet, Husserl eventually came to accept the notion of a self. We'll, we see that with the different models of consciousness, there's a lot of shifting back and forth. Uh, there's a lot of intermingling. It's going to be difficult to find any pure case. As we know, history of philosophy is a messy business. We conceive of pure cases and we use them for lenses through which we can look upon the various positions, and they're useful in that regard, but you always have to take them with a grain of salt. Uh, this kind of thing occurs throughout the sciences. Um, now, uh, we see that there were these two models of consciousness uh, in the uh, within the vision of phenomenological description. There was intentionality, the intentionality model, in which we talk about acts of consciousness without any apparent need, often, to posit some kind of entity which is conscious of objects. And then we have the self model from Theodor Lipps and Alexander Fender, in which consciousness is for uh, first of all and foremost a something experience to be attributed to a self. But that was not all that was going on in this within these intellectual horizons. Now, uh, one thinker who was prepared to call his investigations phenomenological, not often, but he did on occasion, was Ernst Mach. And we see in Mach's writings that he has a different view of consciousness altogether, and this is what I call the content model. Consciousness consists of contents, um, and we describe these contents in terms of consciousness uh, in a convenient way, but we can also describe these contents as belonging to the external world. Uh, Actually, with Mach, uh, you run the risk of losing consciousness. We don't even need to talk about consciousness. The phenomenologists in the Austrian school were ready to say, okay, well, there's seeing on one side, and there's the object of seeing, red, for example, on the other side. There's a consciousness of an object, and Mach says that this is just a matter of convenience for certain purposes, uh, but it should not be taken as some kind of absolute. And this current from Mach is was sometimes called phenomenalism, sometimes empirico criticism, uh, but he liked to call it anti-metaphysics, which that's something I strongly object to, but that's for another discussion. And we find the same thing in the great William James, some approach to consciousness in this way, uh, which James called radical empiricism. And then again, in Bertrand Russell, in his analysis of mind, he calls it neutral monism. Uh, but all of these thinkers who adopt the content model of consciousness run the risk of losing consciousness. You don't really need to talk about consciousness. Um, Now there is an exception among them, and this this philosopher is hardly ever discussed anymore. But I do think that he puts forward an interesting position. I'm not saying that we should accept it. Uh, as I said, all these models of consciousness have their problems. The the philosopher and psychologist that I'm talking about now is Hans Cornelius, who he he was willing to accept the Machian position up to a point where he didn't, at least he thought he did not have to lose consciousness. Uh, he makes a distinction between consciousness and consciousness in German, Bewusstsein and Bewusstheit. Now he thinks Bewusstsein is simply, it consists of experiences, Erlebnisse. But you should not attribute some special mysterious quality, Bewusstheit, to them. Consciousness is a sum total. It's a collection of some kind. Um, so this is the third model of consciousness, uh, the content model. So now we have the intentionality model, the self model, and the content model. And if we reach back a little bit in time, we see that there was also a fourth model, and it did come into play in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and that's a synthesis model. Consciousness always involves a peculiar kind of synthesis, connection of some sort. Uh, Now, you might want to attribute this to Kant. There is something like this in Kant. But I think the philosopher whose synthesis model was most influential, even in phenomenological description, was Hermann Lotze. Um, and here I want to point out that Lotze uh, actually disconnects himself from Kant in an essential way. Of course, he agrees with Kant on various points. He finds Kant to be very important, but this is absolutely crucial that he does not think that all synthetic a priori judgments are to be uh, drawn from the categories of the understanding. So, examples would be certain items of knowledge that we have about color. There are others, but this is his favorite example. If we say, for example, red is different from blue, or we say orange is more similar to red than it is to blue. Well, here we have, these are a priori judgments. Uh, we we see them one time and we know them. We don't have to do induction. We don't have to go through repetitions. Okay, here's red. All right, that's different from blue. That instance from red is different from blue. And here it is. Here's another instance. That one's different from an instance of blue. Once we conceive of red from our experience, or as he and many others would say, intuition, Anschauung, we have it. We have the insight that red is different from blue, that orange is more similar to red than it is to blue. Uh, so this is, in a certain sense, a priori and also synthetic, he says, because the predicate is not included in the subject, as it supposedly is, according to Kant, um, in the case of judgments that are not synthetic. In the case of analytic judgments, um, the the predicate is always included in the subject. So different from blue is the predicate. Red is the subject. Well, different from blue is not included in that subject. Uh, Kant's favorite example is 12 equals 5 plus 7, and he insists 5 plus 7, the predicate, is not included in the subject. But by the same criterion, Lotze argues that different from blue is not included in red. So it's synthetic, but it does not come from the categories of the understanding as substance, causation, the various concepts that Kant derives or claims to be deriving from uh, from his table of judgments. Color's not in there. Instances of color are not there. So here we have a kind of synthesis that's achieved um, by other means than the categories of the understanding, a kind of intuition Uh, Also, not the kind of intuition that uh, Kant attributes arithmetic and geometry to. He says that these come from intuition, but the intuitions of time and space. Well, colors are not time and they're not space. They actually belong to the matter adjustment and not the form. The matter, the matter of sensations, uh, or the material of some sensations, and not the form. Uh, Time and space are forms of intuition. So there's no there's there's no business about categories of the understanding, and no business about a priori forms of intuition. In this respect, Lotze was very influential in phenomenology, and you can obviously see this first and foremost in Husserl's notion of eidetic intuition. But it's also you should also keep it in mind in viewing the model of the model of consciousness with which Lotze is dealing. Consciousness for Lotze, in his terminology, a Verbindung, a connection, a combining, uh, or you could say a synthesis, uh, which is not really prominent among the Austrian phenomenologists. There are hints of it here and there. I think definitely in the work of Karl Stumpf. I don't think I mentioned him in my initial list, but he's very important. Not an Austrian, but he did spend some time teaching in Prague, which belonged to Austria at that time. Karl Stumpf has hints at consciousness as synthesis, but the philosopher who who does this most prominently among the Austrian phenomenologists is Whoso, Edmund Whoso. And of course, we're familiar with his lectures on passive and active synthesis. And this distinction is actually comes into play in Lotze's work. Lotze thinks that there's a conscious process, a Vorstellungsverlauf that goes on passively, and the job of logic, or the job of the philosopher, is to find out what ideas really do go together. And this is a kind of active synthesis. Um, so, at least in broad terms, we find this fourth model, consciousness as synthesis, in Husserl's work. Um, Now, uh, I don't want to say that Husserl simply repeats Lotze, but he's no less Lotze inspired than he is inspired by Brentano. I'll say that flat out. Um, and I don't have my copy of the Cartesian Meditations here at hand because I put it over there and it's too much trouble to call it up here. But I believe it's in section 17, towards the end, uh, where Husserl points out that for him, the synthesis that takes place in consciousness is actually uh, required to make the concept of intentionality fruitful in phenomenological descriptions. So this is the whole motive behind his famous lectures on passive and active synthesis. Uh, okay, so I will leave it there for the time being. I can just simply sum up that Lotze was definitely a precursor of Austrian phenomenology, uh, especially if we make uh, Husserl focal in Austrian phenomenology, which that's very prevalent. Um, now, um, I think I will. I wanted to have a word about what I'm doing here, and I'll just say that really quickly because I'm afraid I'm running out of time. I am trying to put these things together to construct a kind of dialectic for a legitimate, a viable kind of phenomenology. And I think that from this dialectic, we can, given enough time and enough effort, we can develop a kind of aporetic. We can lay out the problems that are to be solved in this endeavor. Uh, I already started developing this kind of dialectic in a YouTube video on the metaphysical triad of phenomenology. Um, I have not gone so far as to really get into the a more systematic aporetic construction, but I definitely think that this can be done. Maybe not by me. Uh, I have too much historical research, I'm afraid, to do. My basic model here, I'll just say, is Aristotle's book Alpha of the Metaphysics and then the book Beta. So, book Alpha is the dialectical construction, and book Beta is the aporetic construction. So, I will leave it here, and I look forward to questions and comments. Thank you.